Where is he? In the private dining house. Board of dining me, and they're finding section of all kinds of.
We'll start the event in a couple of minutes. Request all of you to please take your seats. Just one. Greetings. I'm honored to welcome you all to the 9th IHD Silver Jubilee Lecture on the topic A World Order in Crisis and Transition. What does it mean for human development? By IHD Chairman Professor Deepak Nayyar, Professor Emeritus, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and former Vice Chancellor, University of Delhi. Being organized under the auspices of the Institute for Human Development Silver Jubilee Lecture Series. I am Priyanka Tyagi, the Chief Executive Officer of Institute for Human Development. Very happy indeed to see all of you sitting here who have turned up for this lecture this evening. IHD is celebrating 25 years of its founding this year. The Silver Jubilee celebrations commenced on 25th January 2023. This Silver Jubilee lecture is a part of several lectures, conferences, and activities of the year-long IHD Silver Jubilee celebrations to be concluded in March 2024. We are indeed very thankful to Dr. Nitin Desai, well-known economist, former Under-Secretary General to the United Nations and former Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, to have agreed to preside and moderate this important lecture. I request Dr. Desai to kindly grace the dais. We are also very thankful, yes, this calls for a round of applause. We are also very thankful to IHD Chairman Professor Deepak Nayyar, renowned economist and noted policy maker, to have agreed to deliver this lecture. With respect, I invite you, sir, to please come on the dais. Professor Alaken Sharma, Director of the Institute for Human Development, I invite you, sir, to please grace the dais. Before we formally commence the proceedings of this event, I would like to thank all the participants for their response to this invitation and joining us here. This event is being organized in a hybrid mode. More than 600 people have registered on Zoom. The event is also available live on IHD's YouTube channel, www.youtube.com/IHD India. People who have joined us online are welcome to place their questions and messages through the Q&A box on their screens. And on YouTube, you can engage through the message box, the comment box. Professor Alaken Sharma, co-founder and director of the Institute for Human Development, is a development economist who has made significant contributions to research in varied areas such as livelihoods, labor, migration, poverty, employment, labor markets, political economy, and related issues. He is also the editor of Indian Journal of Labor Economics, the Quarterly Journal of Indian Society of Labor Economics, and Indian Journal of Human Development, the journal brought out by IHD. I invite him to give his welcome and opening remarks. Yes, sir. For the frame you have.
Okay.
Yes, sir. आपको उसके खड़ा होना
पड़ेगा। Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Institute for Human Development, IHD, I extend my warm welcome to all of you who have found time to come this evening for the lecture by Professor Deepak Nayyar. We are indeed very grateful to Professor Nayyar for agreeing to deliver this lecture under the IHD Silver Jubilee Lecture Series. Professor Nayyar does not need any introduction to a gathering of economists, or for that matter, in any gathering of intellectuals in India or elsewhere. His short CV was circulated along with the invitation, as well as also circulated here. He is among our most outstanding economists, and in fact is a multifaceted personality and economist with significant contributions, with several well-known articles and books, at least a couple of them of popular nature also, like he wrote on globalization long back. A Guide to Globalization, has been a policymaker, chief economic advisor of India more than 3 decades ago. In his former avatar, before he went for PhD in Oxford, he has been a member of the Indian Administrative Service. He has been a renowned academic administrator who, as Vice Chancellor of their university, made immense contribution to the development of the university. An institution builder who have nurtured several institutions in India as well as outside India, in fact. He has been chairman of Board of Governors of World Institute of Development Studies, Economics, Helsinki. He is currently chairman of Institute of Development Studies, Sussex. And also several institutions he has served, he's serving. I'm very happy to let you know that he has been member of the IHD Board of Governors for several years. And for the last 1 year, he is chairman of the institute. He is also the president of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, the parent body of the IHD. And in that capacity also, and institute also, I have the privilege of working very closely with him. I'm also very happy that Dr. Nitin Desai, again, another outstanding economist, is presiding over this lecture. Like Professor Nayyar, he is also a multifaceted personality, an economist of high standing, of international recognition. He has been chief economic advisor of India. I don't know whether, of course, before Professor Deepak Nayyar, but immediately preceding or not, but he has been also, before preceding Dr. Nayyar, Chief Economic Advisor of India. He has been Under Secretary to the United Nations, and also has helped, like Professor Nayyar, several institutions in the country as board member, as chairman, and whatever capacity. At least 2 institutions I know, he has been chairman: Institute of Economic Growth, Institute of Development Studies, Jaipur, and of course, several. Professor Nayyar has been also writing a column. Professor Dr. Desai is also a columnist and has been writing a monthly column in Business Standard. Friends, on this occasion, I always say something about IHD. I won't repeat it. For many of you may be a repetition, but we are now 26 years old, not 25. We started Silver Jubilee when we became 25-year-old. We work mainly in labor, employment, human development, gender issues. We have something to celebrate, but of course, many things still to achieve. We have published over close to 70 books, organized close to 350 seminars, conferences. We published 2 journals, Indian Journal of Labor Economics and Indian Journal of Human Development, one published by Springer, one published by SAGE. So rare that an institution in India with only project funding publishes 2 journals. Friends, as my colleague Priyanka just mentioned, during its year-long Silver Jubilee celebration, IHD has been organizing several lectures, several events, I should say. Several Silver Jubilee lectures are being organized. In this series, we had first lecture by Ha Jung Cheng of Swash University, London, Albert Park, Chief Economist, Asian Development Bank, Sunita Narayan, well-known climate activist, Indrameet Gill, Chief Economist and Senior Vice President, World Bank, Abhijit Banerjee, Nobel Laureate of MIT, Francisco Ferreira, Professor, London School of Economics and Director, International Inequality Institute, Thomas Poge of Yale University, and only on 5th February, only 10 days back, we had lecture by Kaushik Basu of Cornell on February 5th. We have still 2 lectures, so we will have 11 lectures during Silver Jubilee. It will end on 31st March. So we'll be short by one before we complete dozen lectures. So one lecture is by John Reyes in mid-March in Ranchi, where we have IHD has a regional office, and John mostly lives there. And he insisted that he will give lecture in only Ranchi. And on 30th March, by well-known management expert Rama Bijapurkar in Hyderabad during our Indian Society of Labor Economics Conference. Friends, as a part of Silver Jubilee, we have been organizing, have organized 3 major international conferences. One conference was New Technologies and Future of Work in Global South during 17 to 19 July, along with ILO, WITS University, and NITI Aayog. It was an important conference in which 250 people participated, including close to 40 persons from outside India. The second conference on inclusive and sustainable urban development in Global South, again organized by the Institute with University of Florida, NITI Aayog, and RIS, was held during 10th to 12th of August. It was also a bigger conference than the first one, 50 people from outside India and altogether 350 people. The last and concluding Silver Jubilee conference, in which I noticed many people had participated, called Global Conclave on Advancing Human Development in Global South, was held during 11 to 13 January 2024. We had participation of over 500 people, including, to be exact, 137 people from outside India. It was not only 4 days, including first day pre-conference. It started from breakfast to dinner. So it was really a huge one, and we felt very satisfied that IHD Silver Jubilee Conference ended with this conference. Friends, I won't take much of your time and obstruct the lecture by Professor Nayyar on a topic very important in the contemporary discourse, both academic and policy. The topic of Professor Nayyar's lecture is very timely and interesting and stimulating. World order, which was put in place about 7.5 decades ago, is under severe stress. It has served several purposes, but now its lacunas have also come into light. And as you know, all of us know that it is, of course, in the severe stress. It has huge implications for development and human development. Also, how it is going to unfold in next one quarter of the century till 2050, and again, what implications it has for human development. It is very interesting, but it is also very challenging to think about world order, how it will unfold till 2050 and what implications it will have for human development. Really very challenging and interesting. But Professor Nayyar has ventured to do this. I am sure that given his canvas of the lecture, canvas of the scholarship, it will be extremely interesting and stimulating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sharma. It is now my privilege to invite Dr. Nitin Desai, noted economist, policymaker, academician. My honor to invite you to please preside and moderate this lecture.
Since I'm presiding, I don't need to talk right now. Let me say that I'll leave my remarks for the end of the proceedings. I invite all of you to listen carefully to what Dr. Deepak Nayyar has to say, and we can have the conversation afterwards, and I shall speak at that time. Let me not stand in the way of Dr. Nayyar speaking.
My colleagues on the podium, colleagues and friends in the audience, I consider it an honor and a privilege to be in your midst this evening. Some of you might be puzzled about the two components in the title of this lecture. So I might begin by saying something about my choice of subject. For some time now, I have attempted to explore the intersections of economics with history and politics. In doing so, I have often sketched the big picture with bold strokes on a wide canvas. This is not about joining the little dots, as children often do. For the whole, I believe, is often different from, if not greater than, the sum total of the parts. The idea of this theme was triggered in my mind by a lecture in this series by Professor Thomas Pogge, who teaches philosophy and politics at Yale. He began his lecture from the UN Charter and its Universal Declaration of Human Rights to develop what I thought was a utopian analytical construct of a world order that leaves no one behind. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I've been thinking about the existing world order in crisis and in transition for some time. Between the lines, I could read striking implications for human development. Now, this lecture is about realpolitik in the contemporary world, and it should serve as a reality check for utopian ideas. I wish Thomas Pogge was here this evening. It was an exciting lecture. The existing world order at any juncture in time reflects the balance of global and economic political power. It can change over time as an outcome of decisive shifts in this balance, but history reveals that such changes are few. This is because the evolution of a world order is a slow process that may span a century or even longer, so that transitions from one to the next can stretch over decades. For this reason, a long-term historical perspective is essential. The early 19th century was a turning point for the world. It was the beginning of the end of Asia's overwhelming significance in the world, and it was the beginning of the rise of Europe, in particular Great Britain, to dominance in the world. For almost a century, from the late 1850s to the late 1940s, the sun never set on the British Empire. In this age of imperialism, the world order was implicit in what Charles Kindleberger once described as world economic primacy, a combination of state power and naval power, which provided protection for national interests in distant lands and merchant ships in distant waters. The early 20th century was the next turning point. It was the beginning of the end of Britain's dominance, and it was the beginning of the rise of the United States to dominance in the world. This process spanned half a century. The League of Nations, established after World War I, turned out to be totally ineffective, if not impotent. At the end of the Second World War, which brought destruction and chaos across the globe, the United States sought to construct a new world order that was largely in place by the late 1940s. It was based on global rules and international institutions in a quest for broadly free international markets, essentially underwritten by American economic strength and political power. This world order, which has spanned 75 years so far, is not without its limitations and flaws. Yet, it managed to preserve the peace between superpowers in the Cold War era and broadly in the world as a whole until around 2000. There were, of course, geographically bound conflicts, in many of which big nations lost small wars. It was also conducive to decades of rapid economic growth, unprecedented in human history, even more so in the era of markets and globalization that began in the 1980s, which improved living standards for ordinary people in the industrial North and lifted billions out of poverty in the global South, although it was associated with an exponential increase in economic inequalities between countries as well as people. The world has changed slowly, yet significantly during the past 75 years. Soon after the end of World War II, at the beginning of the post-colonial era, there were two sharp divides in the world: the East-West divide between the communist and capitalist countries, and the North-South divide between rich and poor countries. The distinction between East and West vanished with the collapse of communism in the USSR and Eastern Europe in 1990 as capitalism emerged triumphant. The world of competing ideologies was replaced, albeit briefly, by a world with a single dominant political ideology. The distinction between North and South also became more diffused with the passage of time as reality has unfolded during the past quarter century. This process began some time ago, but is now much more discernible. Even so, perceptions have changed slowly. There are oversimplified pictures of 1 billion people in rich countries and 6 billion people in poor countries, although there are poor people in rich countries and very rich people in poor countries. The more worrisome divide to me in this world is between the rich and the poor within countries and in the world as a whole. This existing world order is now under stress. The first 2 decades of the 21st century have witnessed a discernible change in the balance of global economic power. Financial crises have dented faith in markets. Mounting economic inequalities have created social and political discontents among people. International institutions, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization are creaking at the seams as they are neither credible nor effective. Globalization is at risk. Economies are going through difficult times, if not crises, with growth slowdowns, double-digit inflation, and persistent unemployment. Politics within countries is contentious, if not polarized. Nationalisms are on the rise almost everywhere. The geopolitical divides are visible and sharper than they have been for decades. International relations are strained, and there are several flashpoints. Clearly, this is the most difficult economic and political conjuncture for the world. In this period, since the turn of the century, the objective of advancing human development has received attention, not only from economists and policy practitioners, but also from national governments and the international community. Yet, the sequence of developments that has unfolded in the world over the past 15 years has made the quest for fostering human development more and more elusive. The financial crisis in late 2008 and the Great Recession that followed in its aftermath led to a sharp contraction in output and employment. The recovery was fragile and slow. The slowdown in economic growth across much of the world economy persisted for a decade. More was to come. The global coronavirus pandemic during 2020-2022 prompted repeated and prolonged lockdowns which shut down economic activities everywhere, led to an enormous loss of livelihoods while economic inequalities mounted. Its direct impact on the health and well-being of people was adverse. The situation might have improved in early 22, but that was thwarted by the Russia-Ukraine war, which disrupted global supply chains in food and fuels, pushing inflation into double-digit levels in most countries. These developments have all imposed a disproportionate share of the burden on the poor, who are obviously the most vulnerable. Now, the object of my lecture is to analyze, so how do I word this? The world order that was put in place at the end of World War II, examine how it has unfolded in terms of experience since then, and highlight its implications for human development. It is clear that 75 years later, this international order is under stress, manifest in multiple quiet crises. Obviously, this will continue until it is replaced by an alternative, so that the transition could be prolonged and the outcome will be uncertain. The structure of my lecture is as follows. I seldom use PowerPoints. I'm using this only because I have 3 graphs to display before you. First, I will sketch the broad contours of change, which reflect shifts in the balance of economic power in the world, to set the stage before the play begins. Second, I will analyze the evolution of the present world order since it came into existence. Third, I will focus on some important manifestations of the crisis in the existing world order. Fourth, I will briefly highlight why these multiple crises could make our quest for human development more elusive. Fifth, in contemplating the future, I will pose 4 questions about where we might be in 2050 and endeavor to provide answers. Let me begin with shifts in the balance of economic power. Now, there is no obvious measure of how economic power is distributed between continents, country groups, geographical regions, or countries in the world. Even if imperfect, perhaps the best index is their share in world GDP. For those who might differ or question it, I will return to it in Q&A. I believe that it is most appropriate to consider shares in world GDP at market exchange rates. In an ideal world, we should consider the entire period since 1950. Alas, that's not possible because comparable national account statistics compiled by the United Nations are available only from 1970. Now, Figure 1 outlines the changes in the share of the 3 major country groups at one time described as the East, West, and South in world GDP at current prices and market exchange rates during the period 1970-22. It shows that the share of the former USSR and Eastern Europe, the East, dropped sharply from a peak of 15% in 1970 to less than 5% in 1990. It dipped further and stabilized at lower levels thereafter. The share of the West, industrialized countries, was in the range of 2/3 until 1980, rose steadily thereafter to be in the range 75-80% until 2005, and then dropped sharply, after which it diminished to less than 60%. The share of developing countries, the South, remained in the range of 20% till 2000, climbed steadily thereafter, rapidly during 2005-2015, to reach as much as 40% in 2022. Figure 2 presents the distribution of world GDP by geographical regions. I divide the world into North America, Europe, West, North, and South together, Eastern Europe and former USSR, industrialized Asia, largely Japan, but also Israel, developing Asia, Latin America, and Africa. It shows that the share of North America and Europe was about 60% until 2005, but dropped to about half thereafter. The share of industrialized Asia, essentially Japan, trebled from 6% in 1970 to 18% in 1995, but just plummeted thereafter and is about 5% in 2022. The story of the former USSR and Eastern Europe, as you will see, is dismal. The share of Latin America and the Caribbean was in the range of 5% for much of this period, while the share of Africa was less than 5% throughout. It is the share of developing Asia that changes from 8% in 1970 to 14% in 2005, after which it rose rapidly to almost 1/3 of world GDP by 2022. And that's the striking part of the story. Now, figure 3, I wish I could have put more countries, but even these 8 make it cluttered. It shows that the share of the United States in world GDP was in the range of 1/4 to 1/3 throughout these 75 years. The story of Japan is a stark contrast of rise and fall. The share of France and the UK fluctuated in the range 4-5% until 2010, dropping thereafter. That of unified Germany dropped from 8% to 5% during 2000-2010, and were down to 4% by 2022. The share of Brazil remained mostly in the range 1 or 2%. The share of India was also in the range 1-2% until 2005, but increased to 3.5% in 2022. The stunning rise of China is the story of this figure. In 1990, the share of China in world GDP was about the same as that of India and Brazil, but it increased to 5% in 2005 and reached 18% in 2022. If I were to add Russia, Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea to this chart, it will become more cluttered, but their share remained in the range of 1-2%. Now, economic power is not simply about share in GDP. It's also about income levels. Now, what I do in table 1 is present evidence on GDP per capita in US dollars in current prices and market exchange rates for 12 selected large countries as a percentage of GDP of the United States, where the US is 100 and the rest are numbers as a proportion of that. And you would see how far ahead the United States is in per capita income levels compared with the rest of the world, including industrialized Europe. Now, the old industrialized countries, Germany, France, Britain, did catch up for a time with the United States, but fell behind again. The story of Japan, as I said, is rise and fall. Essentially, the interesting thing is that Japan's GDP per capita, as a proportion of that of the US, was about 2/5 in 1970, 1.5 times larger than the US in 1995, 2/3 in 2020, and less since then. If we look at these countries, there is a significant convergence in GDP per capita only for South Korea, which rose from 5% of that in the US in 1970 to more than 50% in 2015. The catch-up by China is striking too. Yes, its GDP per capita compared with the US rose from 4% in 2005 to 18% in 2022. Now, that's just to give you a broad idea of, okay, I don't need the PowerPoint anymore. So maybe I can just turn this off.
You continue.
Okay. If you just turn that off. Yeah. Now, if I think of the evolution of the present world order, for analytical purposes, the 75 years since the birth of the present world order are divided into three distinct phases, each with a time span of a quarter century. Now, the quarter century from 1950 to 1975, the end of World War II was a watershed in history for another reason too. It was the beginning of the end of colonialism in Asia as nationalist movements and revolutionary struggles brought independence to countries. The same process of decolonization started in Africa circa 1960. After more than a century of colonial rule, political independence provided these countries with the autonomy to pursue their national development objectives. But the economic interests of European countries in the erstwhile colonies, access to resources and markets, remained alive and strong in the post-colonial era as their governments sought to protect European capital and firms in Asia. The British did not give up hope for a superpower status until the Suez Crisis of 1956. The French also had illusions about their empire in Asia and Africa, so long as it was intact. But this pretense was hollow. It did not last long. The outcome of World War II led to a recognition, followed by acceptance of United States leadership, as both Britain and France relied on its support to manage conflicts that arose in their erstwhile colonies or elsewhere in the world. It was a period that witnessed a decline of two major colonial powers, Britain and France. In this context, it is worth noting that the United States was somewhat different from its European partners insofar as it had long practiced imperialism without colonialism, except in the Philippines, because it was conscious of its own political past and its own colonial past. But it was not new to imperialism, as it had created a network of client states in Central America and the Caribbean in the early 20th century. And in the early post-war era, the United States extended its sphere of economic and political influence to much of South America. The period from the late 40s to the early 70s has been described by some economists as the golden age of capitalism. In the West, for the United States in particular, it was a period of sustained economic growth supported by high defense spending and sensible countercyclical macroeconomic management, combined with shared economic prosperity. This was, in a sense, the American dream, driven by the idea of equal opportunities. It did not last long, but it was in this era that the United States emerged as the dominant economic and political power in the world. During this quarter century, the US actively supported post-war economic reconstruction, not only in countries of Western Europe that were its allies, but also of Germany and Japan, as both reindustrialized to complete their economic recovery by 1970. For Europe, far-sighted political leaders, Adenauer in Germany and de Gaulle in France, were catalysts in its quest for peace. The Treaty of Rome was signed in 1957. It led to the establishment of European Economic Community. To begin with, it was just a customs union of 6 countries, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and Netherlands, that had been at war with each other just 12 years earlier. Compare that with South Asia today. By 1975, the EEC had 9 members, including Britain. This period also witnessed the rise of the USSR in Eastern Europe, as its share in world income and manufacturing output registered a steady increase and peaked around 1970. The Cold War, at its most intense, coincided in time. For the USSR, superpower rivalry with the United States was political, driven by ideology, reinforced by military power, without any parity in economic strength or income levels. The economic rise of Japan, which also started around 1970, was the other important feature of this period. The second quarter century, from 75 to 2000, there were 2 factors that exercised a significant influence on the evolution of the world order during this quarter century. The sharp increase in oil prices in the mid-1970s which pushed the world economy into a crisis, slowing growth and accelerating inflation, was the economic trigger. The consequent emergence of conservative politics manifests in the rise of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, which circa 1980, which undermined the prevalent ideas of social democracy and a welfare state, was the political trigger. It led to a profound ideological transformation in most rich countries. The focus of macroeconomic policies shifted from promoting growth and attaining full employment, a la Keynes, to balancing budgets and managing inflation, a la Friedman. Taxes on individuals and corporates were cut, public sectors were privatized, government expenditures were reduced to balance budget, social protection was diluted, and trade unions were marginalized. The advent of markets was matched by a retreat of the state. This economic liberalization crossed borders as barriers to international trade, international investment, and international finance were progressively dismantled, and world markets were prized open for goods, services, capital, technology, and finance for large international firms, largely from the United States and Western Europe, and globalization gathered momentum. This quarter century also witnessed a development that had profound political consequences for the world order. The economic stagnation and decline in the USSR during the 80s was followed by the political collapse of communism in 1990. The Cold War, that had been low-key for a decade, came to an end. The outcome was a unipolar world in which the United States, already dominant in the economic sphere, also became the dominant political power in the world. The European Union was formed in 1993, ratified by 12 countries, creating a single market with no restrictions on the movement of people, goods, services, and money. By 2000, the EU had 15 members. The US and the European Union together, with a population of a little over 700 million, 1/8 of world population, accounted for more than 1/2 of world GDP. The West was still very dominant in the world economy. The economic rise of Japan was the other striking feature, as between 1975 and 1995, the share of Japan in world GDP rose from 8% to 18%, as compared with that of the United States, which remained at 25%. You would remember, some of you, at that time, Japan's rise led to concerns, fears that bordered on paranoia in the United States, much like fears and concerns about China today. I'll come to that. But these were short-lived, as by 2000, Japan's share of world GDP dropped to 15%, while its GDP per capita was about the same as that of the US. In retrospect, this was deceptive because everybody looked at Japan as the hub of Asia. During the 90s, the small East Asian countries, South Korea and Taiwan, followed Japan in its footsteps. Just as important, in the last decade of the 20th century, developing Asia, in particular China, also started to catch up in industrialization. The sharp economic decline of Eastern Europe and the USSR was the other striking feature of this period, so that their share in world GDP at the end of the century was a mere 2%. This quarter century also witnessed the spread of political democracy in the developing world, even if uneven, across the continents of Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Countries in Eastern Europe, as well as countries that emerged from the dissolution of the erstwhile USSR, both in Europe and in Central Asia, embraced market-oriented systems, then described as transition economies. But in these countries, political democracies remained limited or circumscribed, possibly because of embedded history, as it became almost hereditary that general secretaries of erstwhile communist parties continued as presidents, and so did their progeny. Let me now turn to the third quarter century, from 2000 until now. Now, at the turn of the millennium, the world order was unambiguously unipolar, with the United States at its apex and Pax America at its strongest. However, it was not long before the winds of change surfaced yet again. It began with the shock on September 11, 2001, as Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Virginia. This led to prolonged and direct military engagements of the US in the Middle East, which was sustained by successive US presidential administrations. The consequence was a globalization of Islam that sought and seeks to challenge Western hegemony even now. There was also an erosion of US influence in Latin America as political democracy in the continent revived. The financial crisis of 2008 in the US transformed into a global economic crisis, led to a contraction in output and employment. The Great Recession that followed in its aftermath turned out to be the deepest crisis in world capitalism since the Great Depression. This eroded the triumph of capitalism. It was short-lived. The shift from the G7, in effect the G1, to the G20 in late 2008 during the twilight months of the Bush administration, even if symbolic, was an implicit recognition of that change. The recovery in the West was fragile and slow. It reinforced the balance of economic power, a process which began around 1990, progressively more towards developing Asia, particularly China, where economic growth continued unabated at a phenomenal pace. During the period since 2000, it was Japan that witnessed a dramatic economic decline, attributable in part to bad economic policies, in part to a decline in its population, and in part to its stubborn refusal to allow immigration, even of Japanese people from Peru. It was replaced by China as the hub of the Asian economy. The economic rise of China has obvious political consequences for the world order, as it now aspires for superpower status and competes with the United States for influence, not only in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but also in Europe. Since 2010, this world order has been confronted with mounting problems. Economic growth has slowed down, unemployment persists, inflation is mostly double-digit. There's an exponential increase in economic inequalities, not only between the rich and the poor in the world, but also between the rich and the poor within countries, while the distribution of assets has become even more unequal. Among countries, the benefits of prosperity created by markets and globalization have accrued essentially to a small number of industrialized countries and a few emerging economies in the developing world. The consequent discontents amongst people have led to a massive political backlash. Economies might have become global, but politics remains national or local. The most common manifestation is resurgent nationalisms, riding on populist or chauvinist sentiments. In industrialized countries, there's a growing disillusionment with mainstream political parties challenged by populist anti-establishment movements, national populist political parties, or xenophobic political leaders who exploit fears about openness and immigration as a threat to jobs. The story is similar in the developing world, as nationalist populist parties or leaders challenge or oust incumbent governments, exploiting religious beliefs, ethnic divides, or rampant corruption. Such political mobilization of economic and social discontents has unleashed nationalisms that are attempting to create identities with divides to exclude the perceived other, sometimes the imagined other. This rise of nationalisms has slowly but surely undermined the very foundations of the existing world order. Now, let me turn to the multiple crises in the world order. The raison d'etre of any world order is simple. National laws would suffice if economic space coincides broadly with geographical space. However, in the contemporary world, economic space extends much beyond geographical space. So that, say, rational economic behavior by individuals, the world of economics, utility maximization, of firms, profit maximization, of governments, national interests, leads to externalities that spill over across national boundaries. So that chemical factories in one country produce acid rain in another. Deforestation in one country produces floods in another. Forest fires in one country create intolerable pollution in another, and so on. But countries are not subject to international laws because there is no world government or parliament that can enact laws binding on nations. Obviously, creating rules or laws that are binding on sovereign nation states is difficult since it is subject to mutual acceptance. Thus, a world order, a broadly acceptable framework, is both necessary and desirable to deserve what economists call global public goods, such as peace, the environment, or human health, or what I call regulate global public bads, such as wars, environmental degradation, or pandemics. In recent times, the existing world order has simply been unable to perform this role. Now, let me cite 3 examples. The Russia-Ukraine war that started in early 2002 disrupted global supply chains in food and fuels, not because they are large producers of food and fuels, but they account for a large part of the world's export of food and fuels. And whether it's wheat, maize, edible oils, fertilizers in the world market, it's Russia and Ukraine, and Russia is a primary source of oil and natural gas for the world. This led to double-digit inflation everywhere and hurt the poor and the most vulnerable everywhere, particularly in North Africa and the Middle East and parts of South Asia. The Israel-Hamas conflict that has erupted on both sides of the Gaza Strip could well escalate into a war and shatter the fragile peace in the Middle East, leading to a further spike in oil prices with dire consequences for the world economy. These wars might be localized, but if they continue, they are bound to have a global impact. Alas, there is no credible or effective mechanism that could help restore peace. Quite apart from wars between countries, there are many armed conflicts within countries. For example, in Ethiopia, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Myanmar, Nigeria, Sudan, and Yemen, just to name a few. The International Peace Research Institute in Stockholm says there are 56 such conflicts. The Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law says there are 110 such conflicts, where more than 20,000, 50,000 people die every year. Large numbers of deaths. Environmental degradation and climate change stare us in the face. There are more frequent occurrences across the world: forest fires, floods, droughts, excess rainfall, rising sea levels, receding glaciers, temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius in Beijing, or wet bulb temperatures at which humans cannot survive, and so on. Humankind, it seems to me, is mortgaging its future. In every sphere, it is the poor and the marginalized who are the most vulnerable. Of course, even the rich are not immune, yet effective progress is much too slow. The scrutiny of actions on pledges made, say, in the 2015 Paris Agreement at successive COP meetings, Nitin follows this closely, since then, I believe, is entirely ineffective. Countries wax eloquent in comfort because these are not binding applications and they are to be met sometime in the distant future. The global coronavirus pandemic turned the world upside down for 2 years, imposing an enormous burden on economies and people everywhere. The total number of deaths caused in the world caused by COVID-19 is estimated at 7 million. It was simply not recognized that problems without passports need solutions without passports. Now, instead, at a time when international cooperation and collective action were an imperative, the response of governments was driven by a strange perception of national interests, erecting national barriers to international travel, despite the knowledge that microbes, germs, and viruses inevitably cross borders. That's how the Black Plague traveled, the Black Death traveled from Mongolia to the Mediterranean and to Europe. Or accumulating vaccines when so many people in other countries remain unvaccinated. The essential point I'm making is that markets by themselves may not and often do not lead to efficient or otherwise desirable outcomes. Such market failures occur when there are externalities, what economists call externalities, or an incomplete or imperfect markets. In market economies, it is the role of governments to provide public goods, such as streetlights or public parks, as also to regulate public bads, such as crime, pollution, unfair competition. But there is no world government to preserve global public goods and regulate global public bads. Hence, such functions of national governments have somehow to be undertaken at a global level through a world order that facilitates international cooperation. Alas, the logic of international collective action is forgotten by governments that are obsessed with the pursuit of national interests. At this juncture, it would seem that the willingness and the ability of governments to coordinate in terms of the much needed collective action is simply not there. The existing world order, which is neither effective nor credible, is both inadequate and inappropriate for a world so different from what it was in 1945. Yet, the combination of market failure in the sphere of economics and government failure in the realm of politics makes it exceedingly difficult to reform, let alone reconstruct this order. That's why I wish Thomas Pogge was here. Now, what are its implications for human development? Elementary, my dear Watson. I mean, such multiple crises in the world order have implications and consequences for human development that cry out for attention, but have received scant attention in the literature on human development. And I will highlight these just briefly. At this juncture, there are two ongoing wars between countries and several continuing armed conflicts within countries, in most of which governments are involved. It may be 50, it may be 100. In addition, there are many potential flashpoints across the world that could spill into war or conflict. The number of deaths is large, the loss in livelihoods is enormous, children are orphaned, people are displaced from their homes. The more fortunate find shelter in camps for refugees, even though living conditions are pathetic. For these people, access to healthcare is sparse. Educational opportunities for their children simply vanish, while learning outcomes are a distant dream. Most importantly, human security and human rights are both casualties in wars and conflicts that are proliferating. The consequences of climate change threaten the well-being of humankind as a whole. Even so, it is clear that the poorest countries and the poorest people are the most vulnerable. Whether it's excess rainfall, floods in neighboring Pakistan, droughts, rising sea levels, high temperatures, the irony is that rich countries are responsible for a disproportionately large share of environmental degradation, the accumulated carbon emissions, as their industrialization and prosperity is based on the unrestricted use of fossil fuels for more than 175 years. But they expect developing countries to make their share of commitments for slowing down global warming. I think it is apt to quote the German playwright Bertolt Brecht, who once wrote, "Those who have eaten their fill speak to the hungry of the wonderful times to come." Yet, the industrial North is willing to provide precious little in terms of financial resources or clean technologies to support mitigation and adaptation in countries that are too poor and too small to fend for themselves, and they are large in number. It is clear that the coronavirus pandemic has had a profound impact on human development everywhere. Most probably, there has been an increase in absolute poverty, which would have eroded some of the significant reduction in poverty in the global South over the past 2 decades. The economic recovery has been K-shaped. It's almost certain that income inequalities or inequalities in income or wealth have worsened. The pandemic also has adversely affected other dimensions of human development. unequal access to education, and deterioration in learning outcomes have inevitably hurt the poor and the vulnerable far more, even in rich industrialized countries. Similarly, public healthcare systems stressed by the pandemic and their capacity constraints have provided reduced access for the poor and the vulnerable. In fact, there was a massive deterioration in healthcare for most non-COVID-19 patients, except perhaps for the rich with the finances to manage their needs. In sum, what I am suggesting is that these multiple crises in the world order will not only make our quest for human development far more difficult, but could also retard some of the progress that we have made in the past 15, 20 years. Okay, now I will conclude with an exercise in futurology. Now, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Now, where might we be 25 years from now? The present world order is confronted with a fundamental problem that the balance of economic power is now very different from what it was in 1945. The rise of developing Asia, concentrated in China, which gathered momentum after 1990, has slowly chipped away at the economic dominance and political hegemony of the United States and Western Europe. The story, though, is about much more than China. In 2022, the share of China in world GDP was 18%, while that of the rest of developing Asia, other than China, was as much as 15%. The geopolitics of the world has also changed profoundly because of unexpected developments. Under President Donald Trump, a withdrawal syndrome was visible as the United States appeared to be relinquishing its leadership role in the world. This did begin to change with Joe Biden, but Donald Trump might be at the helm again in 2025. Be that as it may, the decline of Western Europe in a relative rather than absolute sense, most strikingly visible in Britain, is discernible. The globalization of Islam is increasingly seeking to challenge Western hegemony in different ways. Of course, by far the most significant change is the rise of China with its aspiration for superpower status at par with the United States. At this juncture, it may be plausible to suggest, but impossible to establish, that the 21st century, in its third decade, could be a turning point for the world order, similar to that in the early 20th century, which was the beginning of the end of the dominance of the United Kingdom then and of the United States now in the world. But I believe this is no more than speculation. But there is an important lesson that emerges from history. Dominant powers are reluctant to cede economic or political space to newcomers. Let me cite the most obvious example from the first half of the 20th century. The unwillingness or inability of the then dominant powers to accommodate Germany and Japan, both latecomers to industrialization and empire, in the world order, might have been an important factor, among others, responsible for 2 world wars. History reveals that the emergence of new centers of production in economics and new centers of power in politics do have a profound impact on hegemonic powers in terms of political economy. Such processes of change in the world order are always slow. What is more, this is a complex phenomenon which will unravel and unfold over a long period of time. Both the duration and the outcome of this process are unpredictable. In my view, the present conjuncture is an interregnum because the resurgence of Asia, except for China, is not large enough to shift the hegemonic balance. The United States remains the dominant economic, political, and military power in the world. And even if it no longer seeks a proactive role in the world, possibly because its domestic political constituencies are not supportive of the idea, there is no other country yet that could replace the United States in this hegemonic role, which has multiple dimensions. Most important, economic, a national currency that is the equivalent of international money. Less so, institutional, the international architecture of institutional and rules for global governance that was created in 1945. Weak, diluted, but that's all we have. And political, a framework for international peace, no longer credible, no longer effective. Now, given the fluid and uncertain situation, I believe that we are in the early stages of a world order in transition. We can only speculate about alternative future scenarios of the world order that might emerge by 1950, a quarter century from now. I can pose these alternatives in the form of 4 questions. First, are we witnessing the beginnings of a transformative change in the world order over the next 25 years? Second, are we at the cusp of an emerging bipolar world yet again, as it was in the Cold War era, with the United States and China as the 2 superpowers? Third, are we moving towards a multipolar world in which the United States and China may be lead players, but there will be another 6, 8, 10 countries that are also key players? Fourth, are we going to live with a fluid situation where the world order remains in transition over the next 25 years with a de facto continuation of Pax Americana, the default option? Now, I'm going to attempt to provide very briefly my answers to each of these 4 questions. This is bound to be speculative and reckless even for an economist. Yet, thinking ahead is part of the way forward. It might stimulate you to think about how the future might unfold. Now, there are observers who believe that we are witnessing the beginnings of a transformative change in the world order over the next 25 years. The recent rise of Asia and the emergence of its powerhouse economies, among which China is most visible and India also more visible, has led to an idea or a hope voiced by some that the 21st century could turn out to be an Asian century. Now, Kishore Mehbubani in Singapore is the most ardent advocate of this belief system. The parallels drawn are with Great Britain in the 19th century and the United States in the 20th century, when the dominance of these countries was reflected in politics, economics, and even culture. There can be little doubt that circa 2050, a century after the end of colonial rule, and I have shown that, argued that in my book, Resurgent Asia, Asia will account for at least 2/5, if not 1/2 of world income, and will be home to 3/5 of the people on Earth. It will not only have an economic significance, which was for real in 1820, but also a political significance to the world that would have been difficult to imagine 50 years ago in 1970. In terms of per capita income, however, it will be nowhere near as rich as the United States or Western Europe. Thus, Asian countries such as China, India, and Indonesia will emerge as world powers, but without the income levels of rich countries. Asia will not, I believe, have the dominance that Great Britain did in the past, or the United States has now. China will be large and influential, and so might India. But even as a continent, Asia cannot have the dominance that Britain did then or US does now, straddling the economic sphere and political realm, stretching even beyond those to culture, the soft power, as it were, of the United States. We must also remember that Asia is a continent of 48 countries, with a total population of 4.8 billion people that stretches across a vast geographical space from East Asia through South Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, West Asia. Now, given this heterogeneity, juxtaposed with its inherent contradictions and conflicts, it is difficult for me even to imagine a Pax Asiana. For the same reason, I think a Pax Sinica is just as difficult to imagine. In my view, therefore, the idea of an Asian century is hyperbole. It's not a plausible prospect. The idea that we are at the cusp of an emerging bipolar world yet again, as it was in the Cold War era, with the United States and China as the 2 superpowers rivals this time around, competing for their respective spheres in the world, is more plausible, but requires careful thinking. In this lecture, I can only provide you my intuitive assessment, my intuitive hypothesis based on plausible reasons. At the outset, it must be recognized that for the USSR, superpower rivalry with the United States was political. It was driven by ideology, reinforced by military strength, no parity in income levels or economic well-being. In that sense, China is similar. However, there is a fundamental difference in the economic engagement, in the economic dimensions of the relationship, because there was almost no economic engagement between the USSR and the US. In sharp contrast, the Chinese economy is interlocked with the American economy through international trade, international investment, international finance. In fact, I estimate that more than 50% of China's massive foreign exchange reserves are held in US dollar bonds, government securities, or treasury bills. Now, many years ago, Keynes said, if you owe someone £100, it's your problem. If you owe someone £1 million, it's their problem. So China is a lot more vulnerable too. The notion of a bipolar world also, let me say, is often based on projections of GDP, which are simply linear extrapolations based on assumptions. Goldman Sachs popularized it, but OECD, many other people do it now. A few years ago, people said China will overtake the US in 2025. Then it became 2030, 2035, 2045, 2050. And now people are not even sure whether it's 2055. The real world is not about the arithmetic of compound growth rates. The critical determinants of growth that underlie these projections are population, productivity, and exchange rates. For China, its surplus of labor is exhausted. Its workforce has peaked, so that economic growth will now depend almost entirely on productivity increase, and most analysts think it will be about 3% per annum, if that. If it's lower, growth will slow further. Similarly, any fall in fertility rates in China, and there are consequences of one-child families, will have the same effect and dampen growth. Just as important, projections of catch-up are very sensitive to assumptions about prices, particularly the exchange rate. And if the Chinese yuan appreciates less than was expected by Goldman Sachs, the catch-up date will be deferred further in time. Beyond economics, the most important underlying assumption is that the political system in China will be a continuation of the past 50 years. In sum, I'm skeptical about the notion of a bipolar world in 2050. The most likely scenario to me is a multipolar world, in which dominance is not going to be striking. The US and China will probably be the leading countries with an economic and political significance in the world, but it is likely that this group will be larger. Among the industrialized high-income countries, it will include Germany, France, and possibly Britain, although it is attempting to self-destruct from Europe, as well as Japan from Asia. Taken together, these four account for 15% of world GDP at present. It will almost certainly include India and Indonesia from developing Asia, plus Brazil and Mexico from Latin America. Beyond these 10 countries, there could be other countries in the group. I hesitate to speculate. Russia, Turkey, South Korea, Nigeria, Iran, anything is possible. Maybe even Vietnam, but that's difficult to predict. Now, it's time for me to bring this story to a close, and I will do so. What I'm saying is that much as I think that a multipolar world would be desirable, the mere existence of such a multipolar world by itself cannot and will not create a new world order. This would require cohesion and cooperation among the two biggest players, the US and China, with a smaller subset of 8 to 10 players, major countries, but in consultation with a much larger number. G20 is not that forum. To evolve a framework for a world order that is mutually acceptable. When the UN, in 1945, there were 50 countries in the world. In 2023, there are 195 countries in the world. It's a much more complicated world. You will need to evolve a framework that's mutually acceptable. This might be feasible if there is a shift in the balance of economic and political power in the world, such that this new set of multipolar world countries, 6, 8, 10, taken together, are at least as large as one of the two big ones, or larger than both the big ones. If this does happen, it would be an ideal outcome, as it would be in conformity with the present balance of economic and political power, while it would also reduce, even if it does not eliminate, the present democratic deficit in the world order. But the most probable outcome, I must be realistic, is that we are going to live with the fluid situation, where the world order will remain in transition over the next 25 years as events, countries, people chip away at it, so that there is a de facto continuation of Pax America, essentially the default option. Now, historical experience suggests that crises or wars that lead to decisive shifts are catalysts of change. That was so in 1945. Economic and political realities have changed profoundly since then. I think the world should not have to wait for another crisis of such proportions to act. But I fear the existing world order is clearly under stress. The symptoms are worrisome. Indeed, if you want, I will explain why I think the world in the mid-2020s resembles the world in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Yeah? The symptoms are worrisome, and there are alarm bells. We can only hope that enlightened self-interest and a wise political leadership, I don't see it on the horizon, amongst the leading countries, will provide the impetus for international cooperation and collective action. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Deepak, for your slightly pessimistic assessment of what lies ahead of us. And as for somebody who was an insider in the global governance system, I, of course, have some views on that. But let me turn to the audience for the questions, comments that they have before I give my view on this. Yes, please. Gentleman there. Can somebody give him a mic, please? There, the gentleman with the who's standing up. Yes.
Yeah. Respected sir, thank you very much for the valuable and very useful lecture and deliberations. It has been really a thought-provoking thing for us. We'll be now pondering over the issue and try to gather more information, breadth of information, and try to corroborate the things. My questions will be on two counts. It's a very simple question. So far as my knowledge goes, it may be very simple. Whether the world order would able to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 agenda of the UN within the timeline settled by the UN, that is 2030 globally. If so, how this could be achieved and to what extent, and its implications with the global humanitarian crisis. What would be the linkage? What would be the outcome? Second is, it is known that Asia-Pacific region has been severely affected by the polycrisis nowadays that has emerged in the region. What are its implications with the global world humanitarian crisis and how the crisis could be mitigated as the crisis is unfolding into energy, food, finance, climate nexus crisis?
The gentleman there at the back, please. There.
Thank you, Deepak sir, for the nice lecture. I would not call it a pessimistic one, but more of a realistic kind. Because nowadays in India, the media and everything, we are just gung-ho and that India's time has come and we are going to be developed by 2047 and we are living in aspirational India. Though I do not, see the things because of so much of unemployment and so much of this GDP. So basically, what I would like to ask, like there are 2 points, like there is politics and there is economics. So as far as politics is concerned, you said that there is no world government to decide on the global order, world order, because the UN system is on basically working on a voluntary basis. No, it can't be. It is not binding on us. So we are always talking about democratization of UNSC, United Nations Security Council, and P5 going permanent members, India and
Japan and Brazil, they need to be included. So has to have more democratized UNSC. Because they have the veto power and they are deciding on the security matters around at the world stage. And secondly, as far as the economy is concerned, we are, having a high rate of unemployment, and we are seeing, government is saying that next 5 years we are going to be $5 trillion economy, and we are going to be number 3, surpassing Japan and Germany. And by 2047, we are going to be $10 trillion economy. So I would like to have your views on this, because these things don't have any basis. They are more of a hyperbole and don't make any sense to me. Thank you so much.
There's one more there, and then I've got a couple of questions from the internet, which I'll pass on to.
I have 2 questions, one about the world order and another about its implication for human development. On the first one, I think it would be fair to say that the world order was in crisis at towards the end of the Second World War also, when the UN system was set up. So we are not seeing something that is unprecedented. And in a way, the crisis leads to construction. And I wonder if the G20 could not become the forum for the new transition. I would like Professor Nayyar to say more on the potential of G20 in a transition for new world order. The second thing is about the emerging imbalance between manpower needs in developed countries and manpower available in the developing countries. There is a big imbalance emerging, and maybe the developed countries would need human development in the developing countries to sustain their growth and so on. So the world crisis may in fact lead to more opportunities for human development in the developing countries to meet the needs of skilled manpower in the developed countries. Good example is what is happening in Germany and how they are trying to mobilize human resources, nurses and so on from India. And could that not be a more general picture of crisis becoming an incentive for human development in the developing countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Let him take these 3 questions, and I'll come back to you, because they are all the 3 as happen to be a little related also.
Okay. The question about the multiplicity of crises cannot be addressed in the aggregate, in a generalized mode, because the environmental crisis, the crisis related to global public health, and people working in that area tell me that there are many pandemics around the corner. Yeah? So each of those has to be addressed separately. And my argument has been that there is almost no, we know a lot more about collective action today than we did 50 years ago. But 75 years ago, there was more effort at bringing together international collective action. So on the multiplicity of the crisis, there is no magic wand. I think each one will have to be addressed by finding a consensus in terms of international collective action. Whether it is the environment, whether it's global health and pandemics, whether it is peace, war and peace. You will have to find separate solutions. I'm not sure that the distinction between politics and economics in the UN system that was created is any longer relevant. See, what has happened is that the international financial institutions that were created, the IMF, the World Bank, what was then the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and now the WTO, they are in fact totally irrelevant. The Chinese have made, and international financial markets have made the bank and the fund irrelevant. So unless the bank and the fund reinvent themselves, they will disappear without trace. They would have done so had it not been the IMF is going to retrench 1/3 its staff when the financial crisis hit Europe. Begin with Iceland, then Greece. That's what rescued them. So I think those institutions have too large a democratic deficit. They think in an ossified manner, and therefore there's not much they are able to do. And I'm afraid the BRICS Bank is just a poor relative of the Bretton Woods institutions. It is no different in that sense, in trying to help developing countries in a different mode. On politics, have you heard, when did you last hear of the UN doing anything to preserve the peace? Kosovo, Serbia, Israel, now nothing. Anthony Guterres is silent. There is nothing he can say or do. What I am arguing, and Nitin will differ with me, is that the UN system has lost both its credibility and its effectiveness. That it has a democratic deficit in the Security Council, yes, we could try and eliminate it by getting 5 more members, but the problem is that the Security Council with the right of veto itself is a democratic deficit. I think you need, in a world of so many countries now, the number of countries has multiplied by 4 since 1945, you need a different conception and architecture. At least I don't see that either the WTO is paralyzed. It does nothing. It's not even a debating society anymore. The fund and the bank don't matter except for the poorest countries in the world who have no one else to go to. It is international financial markets. And so 3, Ram Gopal, G20 is not the answer. G20, forgive me, is something that George Bush created in his twilight years because he did not want to take responsibility for the financial crisis that happened. G20 has become show business. Every host country makes a big event, but G20 is neither democratic nor consultative. Please remember that there are a large number of countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, that are not part of the process. That is why I think a multipolar world will have to be consultative with others. I don't see G20 as an answer. And by the way, I don't see the possibility. I wish that we could create, and we should create in an ideal world, a multilateral framework that would govern cross-border movements of people. Because illegal immigration is large. Governments turn a blind eye because they need people to do the work that is dirty, demanding, and dangerous that citizens and residents are not willing to do. But you look at Japan. It refused to allow even people of Japanese origin from Peru. There is increasingly, and the globalization of Islam has actually made countries much more resistant to this kind of openness. I wish there could be, if there were a multilateral framework for cross-border movements of people that made a distinction between temporary workers, temporary migration, permanent immigration, and created a set of mutually acceptable rules, it would be good for the world on the whole. But I don't see it happening. I don't see a multilateral framework that exists at the moment. Let me stop.
The gentleman there, Sudipto here, there's one more person, then there's a lady there, 3 of you. Then
Thank
we
you
can
very much.
Stop a little while.
Sir,
Because we've got some questions from the.
a trend that we notice or experience from the a trend that we noticed from the 1990s is widening of democracy among countries, or more and more countries are becoming democratic. But at the same time, widening of inequalities. Or in other words, politically, we are moving towards a more equal society, but economically, we are moving towards a diverging, unequal society. How do you explain this in the context of the global trends that you have explained?
Thank you. Sudipto?
Thank you, Deepak. That was really profound to divorce. And also your speculations about what might lie ahead in the next 2-3 decades are very thought-provoking. It'll make us really think. One thought I had listening to you is that you largely remain in the terrain of economics and politics. and these are surely very important. But it is possible in the next 2-3 decades, the big drivers of change may come from somewhere else, namely huge technological changes. I will mention only 3. One is not just the global warming, but our response to that global warming. Second, of course, is artificial intelligence and the ongoing changes in biotechnology and so on. So we may be living in a very different world. And that's a set of variables which we need to, I'm sure you've thought about it. So if you had any views about it, I'd like to know.
And after that,
That
Meena,
was an
you actually did.
absolutely brilliant lecture, I mean, thoroughly thought-provoking and stimulating. One question I have is this, you mentioned about the globalization of Islam. What exactly does that mean? And how is it going to influence the world order? And secondly, I mean, in some of your speculations, you gave a role to India. Don't you think that India is sort of punching beyond its weight with only 2 to 3% of world GDP? Do you think India can really play a big role? Apart from the politics of it, I mean, the fact that, you know, the politics it's playing a big role in politics, but economically, it's still very, very far away from.
yeah,
Thank you, Professor Nayyar, for that most magisterial, as always, lecture. I'm not an economist, and I hope you'll indulge my ignorance. My sense is that you're sort of in a diminishing breed of people who still speaks of a world order, because now increasingly people are speaking of a world disorder, dystopia, and as Professor Deepak mentioned, the big elephant in the room, the disruptive technologies that we confront, which will completely change the ordering of priorities in the Anthropocene. So we are being now trained increasingly to live with uncertainty, to live with flux, to live with even dystopia. So in that context, the very framing of the search for a world order, wouldn't you think it's still utopian, even though you started with a disclaimer? Is it sort of, is it still relevant? I'm sorry to use that expression for lack of another one. In the quest of a world order, is that valid today? Thank you.
yeah, would you like to?
Yeah, all good questions.
I just wanted to ask you,
Yeah.
say one other thing. For example, we're looking at the fact that the nuclear taboo does not exist at all now anymore. I mean, that was such an important issue that guided the
Sorry, what was that, I missed?
the nuclear taboo.
Yeah.
That is something that has pretty much been thrown out of the window today, even if you look at Japan and various other countries that have stood by disarmament. So that's just a footnote to my question. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, each of,
I feel
okay, well, my capacity to reach it, I'll come to that. You know, I think each of the 4 questions that have been asked are profound questions and difficult questions. I'm not sure I have the answers, but let me in bullet form, because time and patience are both exhaustible resources. This auditorium might soon be empty. You know, the whole question of market economy and political democracy. You know, a market economy works on the principle of 1 rupee, 1 vote. A political democracy works on the principle of 1 person, 1 vote. And social and political philosophers have been thinking about it for 2 centuries. How could you reconcile the two? The problem is that market economies are producing a rapid increase in economic inequalities, both in income and wealth, which is creating political and social discontents. Yet, what worries me is that democracy is in fact being manipulated. You know, many people, I still believe that democracy is a prior. It's the only way forward, because it's the only thing that has self-correcting mechanisms. It is the only thing that has checks and balances. It's the only thing that could provide some semblance and rights and freedoms to citizens. But actually, we need to understand why and how. There isn't time, but even democracy is at risk. Democracies always have flaws and warts. Democracies can be manipulated, but democracies are producing kind of authoritarian outcomes. Democracy is no longer at risk from monarchs or generals. It's at risk from people elected by people themselves, who turn demagogues. So this is a much more difficult question, but I think we need to recognize that political democracy too is undergoing a crisis. I have my explanations of what is happening. I think that essentially the difference between ideological differences between political parties, say even the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrat equivalent, Republican Democrat equivalent, vanished in the age of markets and globalization. They kind of converged to the middle. And those excluded from prosperity, those who had discontents, simply brought the Bolsonaros, the Erdogans, the Modis of the world, roused these discontents and captured them. So it's a difficult question. What I mean by globalization of Islam is the following, that, following the prolonged direct military engagement of the United States, first in Iraq and the European one in Libya, they have actually led to a growing militance and a growing globalization of Islam. There are networks. So even whether it's Europe or the United States, and it's a kind of globalization of radical Islam that is seeking to challenge Western hegemony for the sake of doing so. Yeah, and we can't wish it away. It is there. How serious it is, it's hard for me to say. There are a lot of people who are working on it. Prasenjit Dwara has done some work on it. There are many people who have done some work on it. I can refer you to it. But that's really what I mean, that it is no longer about nationalisms. All right? It is Islam across the world, in Islamic countries, in non-Islamic countries, that there are seeds of unity, and there's a resentment against that Western dominance. It is visible. Sudipta, your question is difficult. Technological change will be profound over the next 25 years, whether it's robotics, international intelligence, 3D printing, whatever. And indeed, what will happen in life sciences, at the intersection of life sciences. But I am not sure that it is going to be able to reshape political processes in a way that lead to cooperation or to collective action. If anything, in the short run, it might accentuate inequalities and kind of enlarge political instabilities, because the advent of artificial intelligence will, again, if knowledge is the basis of development, will widen that chasm between the haves and the have-nots. Now, India's may be special in this process. Your question about India, I should answer. India accounts for, 3% of world GDP, and India may account for 5% of world GDP in another 5 years. In a sense, it is inevitable. Although our surplus labor is not employed, some of it is unemployable, it is still a source of growth on the demand side. Yeah, wages are costs on the supply side, but wages are incomes on the demand side. So India will continue to grow for all our flaws and warts anywhere between 5 and 7% per annum for the next 20 years until its population stabilizes. That is why people are looking at India, for one. The other reason people, and for us, the only economy that is growing. Yeah, I worry sometimes about the statistics, but certainly there is growth. The other reason, remember, is geopolitics. In a world where everybody is a bit paranoid about what Xi Jinping and China will do, India becomes a natural alternative to support in geopolitical terms. So I would say that Modi is in power at a fortunate moment in time, because there is a lot of economic and political interests in India at the moment. And if Apple could, they would relocate more production in India. A story in New York Times by Alex Trevelyan suggests that now Tamil Nadu is producing 15% of iPhones in the world. I don't know whether it's true or not. World order, disorder. Meenakshi, that is a difficult question. I think the existing world order is a world in which disorder permeates all the way through. Now, by order, I don't mean something which is a dictated framework, yeah, which 1945 was. The US was the victor, and the US had the resources, and they try and set in place a world order. What I mean by world order is a multilateral framework for international cooperation that will preserve peace, that will preserve the environment, that will preserve global health, that will regulate, public bads. It could be trade, it could be trafficking in people. What I mean by order is that the disorder is really, maybe I did not, I was not impolite enough. Yes, the world order in some places borders on disorder at this moment. But replace the word order. What I'm searching for and hoping for is a multilateral framework which is broadly democratic and consultative. Perfect equality will not be possible because countries are of different sizes at different levels of income. But people's voices should be heard. Yeah, and that should be a broadly mutually acceptable framework, say for preserving the peace. When countries go to war with each other, the United Nations were meant to do that. But to me, the UN, Nitin may disagree profoundly, looks like the League of Nations. Can't do anything at this moment. So let me stop here. Those are the 4 questions. I haven't answered them fully. They are both all important questions.
I'll take one more question from there and one which, let me read out this question which has come from me. This is a gentleman who asks, can you please shed light on the factors that push China up to reach 18% of the global GDP and the main reasons why India could not reach where China is today, as India and China were almost equal with about $16 billion in 1990. There's one more question we'll take, and then we'll have to stop.
Thank you for the opportunity, sir, and thanks for the insightful talk. What I wanted to ask is that in more so after Second World War, more so in the recent decades, have increasingly, making its effect more bold in terms of where the change are taking place. For example, if I consider India itself, the time India decided that it will more, subservient, I should not say subservient, or more, amenable to the interest of capital, then we have started looking at the development in terms of GDP, in terms of human capital, etc., or many things. So are we not putting more emphasis on the traditional side, which is losing weight in terms of changing the world order and not focusing enough on the capital? And more so because you mentioned while discussing some of the question that democracy. So democracy is a very recent phenomenon of governance in terms of civilization. Are you attaching some kind of perenniality to this system of governance?
No, let me simply say that we need to make a distinction. The object of my lecture was to consider the existing world order, which is what kind of framework do we have for international cooperation that preserves global public goods and regulates global public bads. No more, no less. I was not talking about, I was not talking about what's happening within countries. That would be the subject of another lecture. What is going wrong with democracy? I'm not talking about that. I was simply talking of a world order in that sense. Now, maybe the description is wrong, but that's the phrase that is used most often, and that's why I've used it. I think this is an important question, that please shed light on the factors that allowed China to reach 18% of GDP and the main reasons why it could not. Yeah, well, in 1970, India accounted for 1.5% of manufacturing value added in the world. China accounted for 0.7% of manufacturing value added in the world. In 1990, per capita income in India and China was about the same. The proportion of manufacturing in GDP was about the same. To me, the answer really lies. You see, we could say that India did not make the transition from a very planned economy to relying more on markets to using international markets more. It did it too late. But China also started at about the same time in 1990. I think it has a lot to do with what China did right in terms of economic policies and what we did wrong in terms of economic policies. In 1991, India entered in, it liberalized the economy, but it did so without creating an ecosystem in which manufacturing for industrialization could prosper. The Chinese actually liberalized when they had invested in infrastructure, when they created an ecosystem. Please remember that China did not learn from South Korea and Taiwan, who developed, did not use foreign investment, developed indigenous technology. China learned from Singapore. The major tutor of Deng Xiaoping in 1978 was Lee Kuan Yew. China followed much more the Singapore model of creating enclaves in which you provide infrastructure, in which you provide labor docility, and they created an ecosystem for manufacturing. What did we do? We liberalized unilaterally, as a consequence of which we deindustrialized. Our capital goods sector deindustrialized. Our share of manufacturing in GDP today and in employment in GDP, the share in employment of manufacturing is about 4 percentage points lower than it was in 1991. Indonesia's per capita income was 1/2 that of India in 1990. Today, it's double that of India. China's per capita income is 6 times that of India. China accounts for almost 25% of world manufacturing value added. We are still at 2.5%. So I would say that we got policies completely wrong. We did nothing on infrastructure. We did nothing on education. We did nothing on healthcare. We did nothing on creating an ecosystem that would be conducive to manufacturing. Even today, the big boys of Indian manufacturing are not investing in India. They're investing in China. They're investing in Europe. Private investment is not picking up. So that would be my answer to the question that has come from the net.
Thank you very much.
1 minute, sir.
No.
Yes.
I'm sure your lecture was very brilliant. It was thought-provoking. It means you have thought in future. But about India and China, I think China has become the production hubs of the world, and America is responsible for this. In 1972, when President Nixon visited China,
Can you just be a little quicker?
China, American industries, all the industries went there because the labor was cheap, the system was good, and there is also a difference of governance between India and China. The autocratic regime, authoritarian regime, and the democracy. That is also the difference. And we, in political science, we had studied that yes, the governments have strived to create a world order, a congenial world order, a peaceful order, a world order. But I am also reminded of the philosopher Bakunin, when he says that when the things are in shambles, there is disorder. He describes about anarchic society, and he cites an example, like take some pebbles in a box, shake them, and things will arrange themselves. You also hinted a bit about this. Whatever the governments think, they have attempted very well, but the order will emerge themselves according to the situation, according to the exigencies, according to the demands, according to the wishes of the people. What do you think about it?
I will, just one sentence, because time is running out. The chairman would, I think, would like to make some concluding remarks. I would simply say that what China succeeded in doing was largely its own doing. Okay? That they thought that Mr. Nixon and Mr. Kissinger brought with China was an enabling factor. No more than that. It was not causal. It was not causal. It is what the Chinese did themselves in terms of economic policies. And by the way, the same Chinese are now going wrong, actually. We can't go into that, but they are making big mistakes. Sorry, then I'll stop.
Thank you very much. May I suggest that you have a meeting on China and India one of these days, soon enough. And you'll get enough people who will come and comment on it, and you'll get lots of fun in that.
You don't need a speaker.
No, you don't need a speaker. You can get people. Let me just begin. I'm very happy to be here on this session set up by the Institute of Human Development. And there's a particular personal reason why I'm happy to be here. Very dear friend of mine, Yogendra Alag, was the chairman of the Indian Institute of Human Development for about 11 years. And he continued as a trustee as after that. And he's been very deeply involved in the building up of this institution over a very long period. As you know, he's passed away some time back. But it so happens that yesterday, 14th February, is his birthday.
Yeah.
And therefore, on a personal basis, I feel very happy to participate in an institute which dear friend of mine was involved in. And I just wanted to mention this, that this is to me as much a tribute to my dear friend Yogendra as it is to the Human Development Institute itself, whose Silver Jubilee we are celebrating. This meeting is, of course, much more on the world order. It's not on the UN as such, but the UN is part of what was initially envisaged as a world order. The one thing I would like to stress as an insider from the UN is the UN is not a global governance institution. It has no power of its own in terms of, say, security, in terms of income. It is essentially a communal association. We can argue after that when we have our tea. It is not an institution of governance. It's essentially better thought of as a community association. To think of it as you're living in a some colony here, and you have a residents association. If there are two powerful guys having an argument with each other, there's very little the resident association will do to resolve it. No. The only thing the resident association can do is if there is some commonality of between the residents about what can be done in order to improve their life, that little bit will happen. And that is why, at least when it comes to political conflict, the UN has been virtually powerless. It has not been able to do this because it has no power of its own in terms of security or in terms of human resources to do anything about preventing conflict. It can only do it after the event for some reason, peacekeeping and things of that sort. Here, the role of the UN Secretary General is to speak for the community. And they have done this. For instance, Kofi Annan spoke up in the second Iraq attack, which was made by the USA and UK in the early years of the century. Boutros Ghali spoke up on the Serbia attack. And you mentioned that Antonio Guterres is silent. No, he came up very openly and publicly on the Israel-Gaza conflict. And this was severely criticized by the Israelis on this. This is what I used to argue with the Secretary General when I was there, that you must speak up for what are the views of people who are not direct participants in a conflict. And this is what the only thing that a chairman of a community association can do. So judge the UN Secretary General not as a governor, not as an apex governor, but as a person who's heading a community association. And the effectiveness of UN depends on how well it works. It's failed more or less always. Occasionally, it has had some success on peacekeeping. In fact, only very few. It does come in when it comes to peacekeeping operations, things of this sort, and so on. But it's very, and everybody recognizes this. Where does its value come from? It has done good work on humanitarian relief, on refugee relief, substantially good work, which would not have been done had they not had a process of bringing countries together, because no country is against helping somebody involved in a drought or in a flood or something of this sort. Yes, there'll always be a little wary about how much money they give, but they're not against a communal association for doing that type of thing. Where has it worked more substantively? One area where it could work substantially was a brief period in the early 90s when the political conflicts had become very mild, because communism had disappeared in the West. China was very quiet because of Tiananmen. It didn't speak up much in the UN. Since I was involved in all of those, headed all of those summits which were held in the 90s, I could see that. And therefore, at that time, the UN has succeeded in something which still is beneficial. And that is, it got a global agreement on a development agenda. In fact, by the end of the 90s, people in the IMF and the World Bank who used to ignore what the UN had to say had started taking up that agenda. Kamdesu used to carry the list of the Millennium Development Goals in his pocket. And today, this has got translated into the Sustainable Development Goals, which are playing a powerful role at a national level, even in India. In India, you have a process for monitoring performance of Sustainable Development Goals. This happened because, in a sense, the resident associations of the countries got together and managed to find some common ground. And it has been a successful area. Another area where it has had some forward, not as much as one would like, was in climate change. Because there people could see that what I do is not enough unless the others do something also. And that was recognized even by the rich countries. Now, yes, there are reluctances on their part to do more than what they are doing, etc. But nevertheless, they are committed to the idea of global agreements on climate issues. Why? Because they see things as working together. This is the global order that we have, a very early stage. It's an order which was there when the feudal countries became national countries. There's a delightful thing about the allegiance which the Spanish nobles used to give to their monarch when they came together. And their language was, we who are as good as you will recognize you as a monarch, provided you don't ask us to do something we don't want to do. So, and in many ways, this is what the UN is with its member states. That will be, yes, you will accept what you're trying to do, but only if we agree with you. And this is our point. We in the UN were not people who made the agenda. We in the people, our job was to make countries work around and to work that agenda. And in many ways, this is a very early stage of global governance that we are at. As early as when the feudal environments were slowly building up a national characteristic. So I would say this, I would be very cautious in depending too much on a global governance institution. That's not, in fact, the US formal recognition of sovereignty is only national sovereignty. If you look at the Montevideo definition of sovereignty, the only sovereignty it is recognized is sovereignty at the national level. There is no notion of sovereignty at the global level at all. And this is true not just with the UN, it's true even of multilateral financial institutions. One area where we have had some development of this coordinated management is in some of the multilateral areas. Certainly we had it for trade till recently. Now it's become all regional agreements, bilateral agreements and so on. At one time it was there. You're certainly getting it in areas like climate and so on. Where will we end up? I have no idea. But one of the things that Sudipto raised, and as a gentleman who was written here, is the way technology is developing. You know, if you look at history, some of the greatest changes in national governance, at least, which took place, was because of changes in energy. When you got coal replacing traditional energy, when later electricity replaced coal. Now we are facing a situation by 2050, we have a large-scale replacement of, say, fossil fuels by domestic. Nobody owns wind and solar. Like coal and oil are owned by people. And coal and oil certainly is traded widely, and so is coal, and that will go. We will be moving toward an energy system which is not dependent on somebody who owns the source of energy, on somebody which is part of the international level. Try and work out what the implications of this dramatic change in energy is. And there are others. Artificial intelligence. You were mentioning, but you know, I saw a study on artificial intelligence. They did a comparison of the software worker was not very good, and the software workers were very good. And they saw that after they started using artificial intelligence, the difference between the quality of their work came down. You know, because the guys who are not too good could rely more on artificial intelligence. There are others. Biotechnology is a thing mentioned by this gentleman here. That's a little more uncertain. We still don't know enough for what it will do. But I do believe that the changes that you are going to see now will be the third area, the globalization of companies, because of the the global value chains that are there. There are companies like Apple, which are maybe American, but which have a view on the requirements of political stability in a large number of countries. You know? And there is a certain internationalization of mindset which is coming up in the business world, and certainly in the technological world, and possibly in the environmental world, which will probably drive the thing, along with the changes that are going to take place in technology. But what it will end up with, I do not know. Incidentally, on G20, let me tell you, I once was asked to ask whether the G20 should be asked to take care of climate when I was in the UN. I resisted it strongly on the argument that they are the ones who are most responsible for climate problems. If I leave it to them, you'll never get a reasonable agreement. So you must do it with the entire UN, because the one thing the UN has is it has a capacity for giving voice to people who otherwise have no influence, small island states, etc., who otherwise would have no influence whatever. They will have no access to media, adequate access to media and so on. But in the climate convention, they're very powerful because their votes are needed. So there are many things that one can say, and I'm not saying I disagree with his pessimism, but I'm not sure that we had much. In a way, we are going to be back to 1820, when India and China were at the top, but they were not people who ran the world. They were at the top in terms of GDP.
Economic significance, not political significance.
No, there's no political significance. And it's possible that in 2050, this is what you'll have. An 1820 world where you did not really have as much power in one country as you got later when Britain became a colonial power, then later the United States became an economic power, etc. So maybe go back to 1820 and see and live on that. And that same, whether India and China will be the same level, I don't know. That you can work out and say. So let me just say this, that I'm very happy with what he had to say. I understand the reasons for his pessimism. His understanding of the weakness that has come over the past decade over the institutions that I was in when, which were certainly much better off when I was working for the UN in the 90s. All of them, I think, is very valid. How it'll, and more difficult is the separation of domestic politics, which is no longer as willing to accept internationalization as was the case in the 90s, etc. There's a great deal of protectionism which is emerging in many parts of the world. So I do not know, but I'm sure his pessimism is understandable, but I hope that something happens which will change it. Will the Asians, for instance, the way they are developing, become great liberalizers of trade, for instance? Will they? I'm not sure, but they could, because it is very much in their interest as rapidly growing countries to have wider trade. Maybe it will be trade mainly within each other, as has increased recently. Intra-Asian trade has increased. So with all of these things, may I just end by thanking IHD for organizing this. What it means in terms of human development, probably we should have stepped this a little bit more when we talked about it. But we certainly have talked enough about the evolution of the global system as it is taken place and as it is likely to take place. So thank you very much, everybody. And I look forward to the next meeting on India and China. Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So this brings us to the end of this very informative, engaging, profound, and insightful address. Our heartfelt thanks to you, Professor Deepak Nayyar, for delivering this very profound lecture on a topic that explained the transitions in world order and its impact on human development. I'm sure I'm echoing the sentiments of all the people sitting here and even the people who have just left because it got delayed, and also the people who joined us on Zoom. So this was indeed a very informative lecture. For me personally, sir, it is always a very enriching experience listening to you, more so sharing the dais with the stalwarts like you. And so we are four sisters. We are from Delhi University, and our degrees have your signature. So indeed, it is definitely a very overwhelming and indeed a very enriching experience. Sincere thanks to Dr. Nitin Desai for chairing and presiding this lecture. Several of our board members are here, Dr. Sudipto Mandal, Professor Mahendra Dev, Professor Ravi Srivastav. Thanks to you. Thank you for coming here and joining us, and thank you for all the guidance. The success of this event is dedicated to the IHD team that coordinated communications administration. I would just quickly take the names: Jyoti Girish, Rekha Aswal. We have Aditi Arjun, who have just left. Aditi Arjun, we have Vikas sitting here. Siddharth, Anisha, Shawar, Dhriti. Special mention to Devraj, who filled in the packets, and Anisha, who came, Manish, who helped us in the technical department, our AV documentation partners, and our live event partners, Hemant and Deepak ji and their team, and the faculty of IHD, always pitched in for the events, for the Silver Jubilee celebrations, and help us to make these events a success. Heartfelt thanks to all of you, and and of course, the team IIC. Thank you to all of you. Finally, Professor Alakhen Sharma, thank you for his continued guidance and for coordinating our efforts, resulting in yet another successful event. That is the end. I sign off. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining in. The IHD celebration, Silver Jubilee celebrations continue, but this was the finale in Delhi. We will meet again in Ranchi.